Okay. Oh, that's
Oh,
everything.
yes, thanks. And I was going to remind us all, including myself, that we're going to try to be recording presentations like this, and so that people will be able to view them in the future as part of our resource gathering for suicide prevention information.
I will go ahead and get started. I'm going to try to condense this as much as possible, and I'm happy to answer any questions at the end. If people leave questions in the chat during, I probably won't look at them during because that will distract me, but I'm happy to look at the chat at the end and also like answer questions in the chat. So this study, as David mentioned, or maybe he didn't, now I don't remember, was completed as part of my master's thesis in this PhD program. And we're also very excited to share that it was published yesterday in the Journal of LGBT Youth. It's my first published paper. We're very excited about it. So just some background, as probably everyone in this group is aware, suicide is a leading cause of death for teens, and this is especially true for trans and gender diverse. Throughout this presentation, I'll refer to them as TGD for the sake of time. TGD people consistently in research are shown to have a particularly heavy burden regarding suicide ideation and attempt compared with cisgender peers. And very few prior studies have access to large samples of TGD youth, especially people under 18. So that's why we chose this data set to do this study. Overarchingly, the aims for this study are to look at risk and protective factors for suicide, ideation, and attempt using regression models. Just a very broad overview for people who don't use statistical methods very often. Regression models are used to determine predictors for a given outcome while also accounting for the possible effects of other predictors. So it can help us to see a more complete picture of how a certain factor might impact an outcome. And then we also wanted to understand differences between TGD and cis youth on risk and protective factors. As like a very quick overview to ideation to action models, some of you might already be familiar with some of these, for example, the interpersonal theory. But ideation to action models are unique in describing suicidal risk because they separate out ideation and attempt to look at the different factors that are related to both of those experiences separately. Whereas some other theories might just look at like the term suicidality used, like any sort of a suicidal outcome as one sort of concept. And we know from some literature that they can be very different concepts for a lot of people. So again, just very briefly, these models, the three-step theory, the interpersonal theory, look at ideation factors, including thwarted belongingness, perceived burdensomeness, hopelessness, and psychological pain. And then they view suicide attempt as, when those factors are present and a person has what they refer to as capacity for suicide, which is essentially some factor or set of factors that permits a person to override those innate sort of biological predispositions to protect ourselves from harm or from risk, that a person is more likely to have a suicide attempt. Just to note that this study focuses on ideation specifically, and we also have results showing like some of the factors related to attempt as well, just because it's important information to have. Participants for this study were around 27,000 8th and 11th graders who participated in the Oregon Healthy Teens Survey that's conducted, of course, by the Oregon Health Authority. We used the 2019 data, and approximately 5% of this sample identified as trans or gender diverse, so just over 1,300 participants. And as probably many people in this group know, data was collected using stratified random sampling across the state, which is another benefit of this data set. So just to kind of start out as an initial overview, we looked at comparing rates of suicidal ideation and suicide attempt amongst TGD students, cisgender boys, and cisgender girls. So you can see here from the percentages that we've highlighted, there is a significant disparity amongst gender groups. So that's sort of a starting place for this study and acknowledging, as I mentioned at the beginning, the significantly higher burden that this community is carrying. As we built our models, we included a number of different factors, including gender. So for some of the models, we separated out cisgender girls, cisgender boys, because we know also from previous literature that there are sometimes differing risks amongst those groups as well, and TGD students. We looked at differing suicidal outcomes, and then risk factors that we identified based on the theories that I mentioned before, including depression, being kicked out or abandoned by parents, feeling unsafe at school, and bullying, as well as protective factors, or potential protective factors, including I have at least one supportive adult at school, perceived problem-solving ability, which was asked in 2 questions that I'll highlight after, as well as previous volunteer work, and then just some things we added to the models to ensure that we were trying to respect many different aspects of people's identity as much as possible, including disability status, SES, racial identity, sexual orientation, substance use, age, grade, and county. And I see someone has their hand up. I think it's Jill.
Yeah, I was just, Annette was wondering if you could lean in or speak a little louder so that more folks can hear better.
Oh, okay. Sorry. So our first hypothesis is that expected risk factors just identified in the previous slide will predict suicidal outcomes. As a note, in hypothesis 1 as well as hypothesis 2, results are broken down into 2 parts. The first part is comparing those who did not have suicidal ideation with those who did. And then the second part compares those who ideated with those who went on to have a suicide attempt. So for the first part, looking at risk factors, this is a lot of information. You don't need to try to take all of this in. I'm going to highlight the things that we want to pay the most attention to in this. We can see that amongst gender groups that the TGD students had higher or were predicted to have ideation compared with being non-suicidal at a higher rate compared to cisgender girls. Cisgender boys had a lower rate. Depression, being kicked out or abandoned by your parents, and feeling unsafe at school all significantly predicted suicidal ideation versus being non-suicidal, as well as some forms of bullying. So being perceived as LGBTQ, bullied for your appearance or other reasons also predicted suicidal ideation compared with being non-suicidal. Second part here, we're taking for the students who were in the group of ideating, seeing what factors differentiate them from those who attempted. So same factors, or at least some of the same factors. Those who identified depression were more likely to attempt versus ideate alone. Those who were kicked out or abandoned by their parents, as well as those who felt unsafe at school, were more likely to have an attempt, as well as sexual harassment, bullying, being perceived as LGBTQ+, and appearance. For our second hypothesis, we predicted that positive indicators of support and efficacy would act as protective factors. So for this model, all of the previous factors were included, and then we added in these protective factors to see what their effect might be. So in the top half here, again, we're comparing those who were non-suicidal versus those who had ideation. And we can see that those who more strongly endorsed having an adult at school that cares about them, more strongly endorse I can do most things if I try and I can work out my problems, were more likely to be non-suicidal compared with those who had ideation. And then in the second half of the model here, looking at attempt versus ideation only, those who more strongly endorsed I can work out my problems were more likely to be in the ideation only group, or we might also phrase that as less likely to have a suicide attempt.
Holly, this is a really basic question, but I want to just be sure I'm understanding the stats right. So this is not looking at the general population. This is just the group that the LGBTQ group that got pulled out.
No, sorry, thank you for asking that. This is for all genders.
Okay, so this is for everybody as opposed to like specifically linked to that group of LGBTQ. All right, thanks.
So all the different genders are included both in this model and the hypothesis 1 model.
Okay.
So these factors that we see in here, they're all included in this same model. So like we have all the different gender identities, and then in this model, we have added in these additional factors. Volunteer work performed in a way we did not expect, and you can see here from the number that it actually seemed to increase the risk of a suicide attempt. We, of course, cannot actually know why that is because we don't have enough information, but I'm happy to speculate on that at the end if you would like to ask questions about that. Our third hypothesis is essentially that TGD youth would be more likely to report risk factors and less likely to report protective factors. So for all of these models, we have a binary variable of TGD youth and cisgender youth, just comparing them on different outcomes using binary and linear regression models. So these models don't predict any suicidal outcomes. We're simply comparing these two groups on like their likeliness of reporting these different factors. So you can see here from this first page that TGD youth were significantly more likely to report bullying, depression, and being kicked out or abandoned by their parents. You can see from the number here in the odds ratio, like TGD youth were roughly twice as likely as cisgender youth to report being kicked out or abandoned by their parents. And we saw in previous models that that was a significant predictor of both ideation and attempt. For protective factors, we identified ones that really stood out in the model, especially regarding ideation. TGD youth were less likely to report like a stronger endorsement of there's an adult at school that cares about me, and they were less strongly endorsing that factor that was related to both ideation and attempt, that I can work out my problems. So sort of overarchingly, we found that expected risk factors predicted suicidal outcomes, and expected protective factors generally predicted being non-suicidal versus suicidal ideation. And we also found that TGD students were significantly more likely to report risk factors and less likely to report protective factors. In terms of strength and limitations, the OHT uses a representative sample, and this study focuses on TGD youth. And though like we didn't really focus on attempt because there are not items on the survey that ask about suicide capacity, we did look at both things related to ideation and attempt to like continue to honor that differentiation. Limitations, there are always limitations with secondary data analysis because of course surveys are not designed for potential research projects that no one knows are maybe happening yet. And possibly because of, wanting to protect people's privacy, understandably, and, sometimes smaller numbers, we are not able to separate out different gender identities within TGD youth, which is something that we're really hopeful to do in the future. And we also acknowledge that Oregon results may be limited in their ability to generalize to some other states, given especially the subject matter. I'm sure we can all imagine that there are some places where these results may look different for a number of political and social factors. And then just a kind of quick overview of some things that we considered in terms of like possible implications for things that we found. Noting that school has a lot of potential in terms of protecting youth, in terms of like building skills and social support. And a lot of research also indicates that school can also feel like a really unsafe place for trans and gender diverse kids. More support is needed for them in terms of interventions, and especially TGD youth of color and other minoritized identities who may be impacted in multiplied ways. Interventions that center youth leadership can be very effective. I know Sources of Strength is something that's used in Oregon as an example of a youth leader-based program, so that's very encouraging. And then just acknowledging that targeting oppression and fostering welcoming environments can potentially reduce suicide outcomes, not only for TGD youth, but for youth of all gender identities. And I have my email here, so if anyone has like something they'd like to ask me, but they would not like to ask me now, or they just want to chat more about it, I'm happy to also chat one-on-one. I see there are comments in the chat.
Holly, I feel like this study just sort of solidifies the idea that, you know, the what we've seen around LGBTQ youth being at higher risk.
Yes, and research does consistently show that both people of minoritized gender and sexual identities tend to have higher risk in different suicidal outcomes. This study did, I saw a question in there asking if this was about sexuality as well, and we did include that as a covariate, so it's in the models, but it was not like a direct focus. This was focusing on trans youth. Jill.
Two questions. One is, do you envision, like, are you intending to repeat the study? Like, now that you have the bones built, is it easy to plug in future student health survey data? One question. And then second, I would love to hear your thoughts about why volunteering didn't produce the results that surprised me also.
Yes.
And so I would be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Totally. In terms of replicating, I'm certainly open to it, and I'd be happy to collaborate or partner if people have things that they would specifically like to look at. In terms of volunteer work, that definitely surprised us. My only speculation that we've kind of chatted about before is because these are youth under 18, we wonder if maybe their volunteer work is not of their own choice. So like when we're minors, like maybe our parents drag us to things that we don't really want to go to, or even a potential of like if family does not feel safe or supportive, and family is also like insisting a student is participating in something that maybe they don't feel good about, that potentially that could have like that kind of implication. But like I mentioned, that is purely speculation. Someone asked about the published study. I'm happy to send that out. Oh, I see. Yeah, David did share it out, so it looks like there's access to it. I also had the thought of potentially church related. I know that that could be potentially controversial, but also we can acknowledge that there are spaces like that that are not safe for trans kids.
You know, Holly, I was wondering if
I'm looking at the budget.
if you were writing a headline about your study for a newspaper or something, like what do you see as like are transgender kids really different from you know, is what's happening with them different from the regular population? What's kind of the headline?
That's a good question, and I like to spend a lot of time thinking about titles, so I don't know that I could have like a good one right now. David and I spend a lot of time like writing titles. Are trans kids really different? My personal opinion is I don't think so. I think the way that they're treated is very different. We know from the models that we used in this study that these factors do not fully explain the differences between cis kids and trans kids in terms of the burden of suicide risk.
Yeah.
If you look at the paper that we wrote, there are a number of factors listed early in the introduction regarding like witnessing of violence and discrimination towards other trans people, experiencing violence and discrimination as a trans person, as well as just bearing witness to like the way in which our society is currently treating trans people in the news, in politics, that this is like a widespread discrimination experience. And so my opinion is that it would be heavily related to that. Especially going back to that number of like trans kids being twice as likely to be kicked out or abandoned by their parents compared with cisgender kids. It shows like the multiple layers that they can experience, not only like societal discrimination, but often discrimination at home as well.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense to me. And I just will say to the group that when we get to the end of this discussion, I'd like to just pause for a moment on policy, because there's so much housing policy stuff coming through this session, and I think that it has a really particular impact on this population.
Thank you. I see 2 hands up, but I don't know who was first. So whoever wants to go first.
I can go first. Annette, will you mute yourself though? Because it's really.
Oh God, I'm so sorry. Yes.
It's all right.
Not used to being at the office.
Yeah. My question was around, so one of the survey questions, and I don't know if it was included in 2019 or not, it might be new in the student health survey since then, is around access to firearms and how quickly firearm access can happen. And so I wondered about, you named that you didn't use the attempt pieces in there because it assumes access or ability to attempt. And so I just was curious about that, knowing that question is now on the student health survey and will be, does that change that at all for you?
It was on the 2019 one, and we did consider it and talk about it. I think we ultimately decided to not include it because it's not broad enough and it's not inherently, I mean, I'm trying to remember the exact wording of the question, but does it ask like, could you just go get one right now, or is it?
Yeah, it asked how do you have access to a loaded firearm and how quickly? Yeah.
I think basically we didn't select to use that because it's a single factor, and capacity is about many things, including that, but also aside from that. So for example, a common example of like acquired capacity is someone who has a consistent and intense exposure to pain and suffering. So that's like a very common capacity factor that was not highlighted. There were not measures of like self-harm and what was the other thing I was thinking? Like innate factors like impulsivity. So I think we just kind of decided that one item was not enough to like really dig into that concept. But I would certainly be interested to see how it's related.
I was also just going to add that access to a firearm predicts death, but not necessarily the outcome that we were looking at, which is a suicide attempt that did not result in death. So that's another reason why we didn't include that.
I think Mavis was next.
Yeah. Hey, Holly, congratulations on your publishing. That's really exciting. I had a question. I wanted to make sure that I saw this right. So on some of the results, bullying, like race-based bullying, wasn't significantly associated, but race was. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Yeah. Could you kind of explain that? Do you think it's more from like an internalized, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, if you don't mind?
I think that's a very challenging one I'd have to do like significantly more reading. I know that when I did my full thesis project, I looked significantly more at those other identity factors. And for some identities, being of minoritized racial identity was protective against ideation. And we know certain reasons why that exists, community connections and like family narratives, like lots of different things that are protective. In terms of bullying, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if it's that maybe the rates were not high enough. I couldn't like imagine like exactly what they would be. Um yeah, David, do you have thoughts on that? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think it deserves its own analysis that we weren't really able to address here, but that's a great question.
Yeah, great job.
Thank you. Karen, I think.
Yeah, I just wanted to explain the message I put in the chat. So Portland State University, we made some suicide prevention webinars, and they're aimed mainly at the Portland State community, but there's relevant information for any students or family members who identify as LGBTQ. And it was developed jointly by our health center, the School of Social Work, and students in the PSU's Queer Resource Center. So I put the link in the chat, and the other modules, there's 4 sort of general suicide prevention modules for that age group, but then there's some population specific ones. There's the LGBTQ one, there's one for veterans, students who are veterans, international students, and also students with autism.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Before I go to Jill's question, I want to return to Mavis's question because a thought just popped back into my head. And that is that we know in some circumstances there's also underreporting from kids. So I worked with an undergraduate student who did a poster like for an on-campus event where we learned that it was actually relatively common for specifically Black students to report that they did not ideate, but that they did attempt. And sometimes it's about the way that the question is worded, that like it's not accessible for people, or like, for example, I think the way it's worded specifically is, did you have serious thoughts about suicide? And having worked with lots of people clinically around suicide, how everyone defines serious thoughts of suicide is very different. Some people will say, like, it passed through my mind, that's a serious thought. Some people are like, if I'm not like literally on the precipice of attempting, that's not a serious thought. So it's also very possible that that effect is there, and maybe just in the way students didn't feel comfortable sharing that they were bullied, or it didn't feel like safe to approach that topic, any number of reasons. It's also possible that it was underreported. Jill.
Mine is a comment on the same topic. There's some research that actually I think Dr. Kendris Watson put it in his presentation to the Suicide Prevention Conference last year, not this most recent one, but the one before it, around folks having the language for microaggressions or having the language for race-based bullying, and that when young people of color are taught what a microaggression is and what it looks like, and affirmed that with language, so not taught what a microaggression is, but giving language to that, that's protective. And so I would that doesn't feel surprising to me, those results, given that in like, even with my own kids, like when you can talk about it and understand why you felt the way you felt when somebody said something that wasn't the N-word, but still was was race-based bullying, that's protective. And so anyway, I just wanted to add that to the pile of conversation.
Any other questions? Well, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. And like I mentioned, if anyone wants to send me an email, I'm happy to chat more.
Great. Annette, did you want to say something about some of the legislation that's been dropped?
Yeah, I want to say that our LGBTQ advisory has talked a little bit about supporting. It's going to really, I think, be wrapped up in a big budget ask, but there's funding for host homes for runaway homeless youth, and such a big piece of that population is LGBTQ. And there's so many kind of intersecting risk factors there that we were wondering if the Alliance could be one of the organizations that signs on as supporters for that. And I just wanted to run that by quickly to see if that makes sense to this group for the Alliance to step into that space or not.
I think so. I mean, I think we could say something about the research backing up the higher, like just about the risks
Yeah.
for homeless youth and
Just it's really neat to get a presentation like that and have immediately, Holly, there's all these ways I can think of how useful it'll be in our real world work. So I just want to thank you. I also want to invite you, if you have any interest in ever visiting or joining our LGBTQ advisory, we would love to connect with you.
Thank you.
All right, so I don't want to stop the meeting. That was just kind of a check-in.
yeah, that's just making me think about the homeless youth continuum in Portland, which is the continuum service providers for homeless youth. And I'm just sort of wondering if your committee, well, first I'm wondering if they are aware of that legislation. And do you know who sponsored that legislation?
Oh, I didn't come to this meeting thinking about,
Yeah.
so I'd have to go back and look. But I could reach out to the homeless youth continuum though and talk with them.
I think
That's
that it would
idea.
be
If you
a
have
good
contact there,
connection.
that would be great.
It would be a very good connection, and there might be somebody there that might be interested in the work group.
Okay. It's just interesting to think about how does evaluation and research intersect with our policy work, and every once in a while it's like, okay, it's the evidence for where we think we need to move things forward.
Yeah. Well, so moving on, I'm actually realizing that I just sort of skipped over like the minutes from the last meeting and just sort of a quick look at the agenda. And we have not actually met since December. And this is just sort of an example of like what happens when you skip meetings. That I've also fallen down a little bit on the job related to this committee. And so I apologize for that. And I have time this afternoon to catch up on some things. I wonder, Jen, maybe if I could share my screen, I can just briefly review a couple things that remind us of a couple things that we've been working on and check in on those things. Let's see. I'm going to, let's see. 1 second. Let me pull up what I want to share.
Do you want to stop the recording?
Yeah, I think that, yeah, it was really to get a recording of that presentation.